Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our third of three, potentially third of three, biomass financing webinar. Welcome back for those of you who attended the first two, and welcome to those who are brand new. My name is Sam Bayless. I'm the Senior Project Manager at Valley Vision over our We Prosper Together initiative under the California Jobs First program. This initiative started almost 2 years ago, really looking at what does the future economy of the capital region look like. And that capital region includes an 8-county region around Sacramento, all the way from Lake Tahoe, all the way to Colusa County in the east. But we're really excited to have you all here today to continue talking about biomass opportunities in the capital region. This biomass really came to the forefront during our build up in the early times of the We Prosper Together initiative, really as a way to not only increase economic opportunities and job opportunities, particularly in rural areas, but also through a climate lens that We Prosper Together takes very seriously, building wildfire resiliency, cleaning our air, and avoiding local pollutants. Well, we have some really great speakers here today. Lindsey and Neal are joining us once again. And then we have a new speaker joining us today, Dan Tangherlini. And with that, I will go ahead and hand it over to Lindsey. Actually, first, please, everyone go ahead and drop your name and organization in the chat, and we will go ahead and get underway. Thank you.
Thanks for the little recap. And yes, this is the third of three, but looking to do a fourth to go deeper into funding. So we'll talk about that at the end. But the first one, session one, we talked about building out the concept. Session two, we talked about defining the product and building out, making the most out of the revenue sources. And then today we'll talk about the financing mechanisms to bring it all together. And we're really excited and really thankful to have Dan Tangherlini with us today. He's with the Emerson Collective and has some great experience and knowledge that we're super excited that he will come and give us some real talk today about financing. So with further ado, Dan, please share a little bit more about yourself and jump right in front and provide some insights on what you have for financing for us.
Thank you so much, Lindsey. And it's great to be in community with all of you around this important issue. I had a chance to meet Lindsey out at a site of a potential biomass energy facility that was a community-led, community-driven initiative. Super interesting, super creative. I'm hoping that the world turns back in the direction of making sure that that project happens, because I think it's part of the imperative of what's necessary for us to improve forest health and regeneration through the careful and smart stewardship of the resources in those forests. It'd be great to turn that wood into homes and energy, a stronger forest health rather than smoke, which is what's happening now, and that's disappointing. My work has been at the intersection of public and private finance when I started as a intern in the Chicago Park District to working in the federal government at the Office of Management and Budget, the U.S. Department of Transportation. Went over to the D.C. government where I worked as the director of transportation. Later, I ran the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority, came back as the deputy mayor and city administrator, and then went to the Treasury Department, where as the CFO, ran the General Services Administration. And after leaving government, went to work for a real estate private equity firm, a small tech startup, and then I joined the Emerson Collective as the CFO. I've been working for the last 5 years in a programmatic area around public-private partnership, around financing community economic development projects. So had a lot of experience in trying to bring projects and ideas, particularly community-led efforts, to a position of financeability. So hopefully some of that experience could be useful for folks today. My thoughts around it, when Lindsey challenged me, like, what would you tell people about how do you make a project interesting, engageable, financeable from a position of philanthropic partners, impact partners, and I would just say investors in general. I would say that you really need to think about even your philanthropic partners in the same lens as you would any private capital investor. If you start with that discipline, you'll find that the conversation with the philanthropic investor actually goes a lot faster and a lot easier. What you may then need to do is just demonstrate that the return profile, the financial return profile might be different for the philanthropic investor. Impact investors like to see a similar and not deeply impaired financial return profile, where you might find the opportunity for negotiation with a philanthropic or an impact investor is around like the period of return, the cost of the capital, maybe other measures of performance other than just simple IRR. And so starting with the IRR and working back from there, and then saying, okay, if I can't match the hurdle for a traditional commercial investor, what are the other things that we're doing in the community that are measurable, that are ways to pitch the return to the philanthropic investor? So what I'd say is that there are really four things that you need to really make a project one of interest and engagement for ultimate participation for any kind of investor. But the first is a real budget. You know, what is this going to cost? And what is that based on? Like, where are you getting those numbers? How are you making those assumptions? Um, Round numbers are an indication of a lack of accuracy and research, right? So your number should end in a seven. I'm kidding, but there's something to the fact that, like, if you're like, well, we think it'll be $10 million. Nothing's ever $10 million. I've never seen anything that cost exactly $10 million. So the having some deep initial, it can even be rough order of magnitude based on other projects, with an inflation factor, something that you can do, reasonably easily will give a sense of reality to the budget. And by starting with a real budget, I think you're building legitimacy and credibility with the people you're having the conversations with. Real demand, right? So there has to be some explanation of where this is going. If we build it, they will come. Worked in that movie a long time ago called Field of Dreams, but I'm not exactly sure I've seen it since, right? So the having some clear definition about who your demand is, who your off takers are, what they're going to pay for that product, and some explanation of how you arrive at those conclusions. These are estimates. Estimates are always going to be subject to the vagaries of reality, change of conditions, change of environment, but demonstrating the fact that you're respecting the time and the energy and the investment of the people you're actually having the conversation with, showing your estimates, showing how you arrive at them is a form of kind of respect. Um, Real community support, demonstrated community support. The last thing people want to do is get into an investment that somehow generates a massive amount of pushback or negative energy, right? People, particularly in the philanthropic and impact space, let's be honest, they're doing it to feel good. They're doing it to feel good about what they're doing. They're doing it to, like, we're trying to change the world. We're trying to make the world better. They're not doing it to make communities really mad or angry or upset someone. So having like a clear path to demonstrate that this is not going to generate a massive NIMBY reaction that's then going to, you know, uh, put the philanthropy, which is trying to do good, in bad light, is a very important element of part of your sales pitch. It was one of the great attractions of the conversation we had with Lindsey, is that this was actually a community initiated effort, a community of saying, look, we're afraid of forest fires. We're afraid of what it's going to do to our community. What can we do as a community to actually initiate effort to fight back while improving forest health? And then finally, a real path to implementation. So having a budget, having demand, having community support is a lot. But also saying, like, but we also have the site. We know how we would get it. Here's the supporters. Here's how we're going to work it out with the PUC, or who are those barriers. Even if you haven't solved necessarily the barrier, the fact that you've identified the barrier, you know what that path is, you have a range of estimate for the time of implementation. These are things that give legitimacy and credibility to the proposal. Now, within that context, a possible pitch to a philanthropic sponsor could be, I don't know these answers. Here's my what I know so far. I don't know these. Could I have a planning grant to go and explore how I actually get those answers so that I could come back with a more substantial, clear path to implementation and success? That actually is a reasonable first bite at the apple and a good way to demonstrate engagement. It's a great way to build partnership. A lot of this work is based on trust, it's based on partnership, it's based on relationship. And so part of what you have to do is think of a path to develop all three of those components as well. So those are kind of like my high level kind of um, uh, thoughts about how you actually build that kind of engagement, that attachment, that interest, and how you make it appealing and interesting to people who will be your kind of initial kind of evaluator of the work. The interesting thing about all of those things, they're all pretty much the basics for any investment of any project, whether it's philanthropic or commercial capital. I think that the key in philanthropic or impact capital is actually demonstrating the same kind of rigor, interest, and engagement of research and analysis as would be in a commercial deal. And what you might actually discover somewhere along the line is actually this might in fact even be a commercial opportunity, which is an exciting alternative because then it's you're really working with people who actually have a imperative to deploy capital, whereas sometimes in the philanthropic area there isn't always that same clarity of imperative. So I know I was supposed to go on for another 5 minutes, but maybe we'll use the time instead for questions, or maybe Lindsey, you could challenge me on some of those assumptions as a person who's actually worked in this space and pursued this work.
Yeah, no, I'll definitely try to do that. But we do have a question that I'd like to ask if that's okay first.
Sure,
It's
yeah.
from Gone and it says, which corporates are folks currently seeing strong offtake interest from? Oh, I guess this is a more of a community answer, a community question. So I don't know if folks that are on the call or on the Zoom would like to provide some input to Gong um, in the
I
chat
do,
for
I,
us.
I do have some thoughts about that
Oh,
though,
great.
just because I've seen some projects where the offtake agreement actually happens with the community itself. And oftentimes, I ran the subway as the vice chair of the Water and Sewer Authority, and in Washington D.C., the number one and number two user of electricity were the subway and the Water and Sewer Authority. And so, what's interesting is that there may be within your communities themselves big nodes of demand that exist that don't actually have an industrial connection. So providing power to your school district, to your local jurisdiction, these could even open different forms of capital or borrowing authorities that jurisdictions have. So that might be something to consider as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And we do like with Camptonville Community Partnership, we have a strong partnership, and it's almost like a public partnership with the Yuba Water Agency, which is our
Mhm.
local water producer and provider. They also have generate power from their dam, and so
Right.
it builds one again community support, community interest, but then yes, a guaranteed um, got us capital, but also can provide some expertise as well as people that work with in big projects and building up, just community infrastructure and whatnot. So that's a really
Yeah.
good point that we're seeing some strong success with building public-private partnerships, especially at the beginning to try to figure out these things together. But yeah,
Yeah.
that's a
So local, regional, county, and even state facilities, are oftentimes some of the biggest demanders of energy within the federal facilities. That's a whole other wor- world of engagement. There's like, I worked in the Obama administration though, and ran GSA. There was a lot of interest, like an idea like that, using to power a military base or offset the power demands of a big federal facility is something we might have been interested in. I don't know what the current appetite is for that, but within the context of the Forest Service, there might be some connectivity there as well. So
Great, thank you. Um, we have, let's see, from Mural says, some years ago, I went to the workshop about how the state of California begun training and supporting teams of local volunteers to help with the forest fuels reduction. Do these teams still exist and can they help with these projects? I haven't heard, maybe people, again, we have a lot of great people on this call of local volunteers that help with forest fuel reductions. Um, but the state has definitely done a lot of work with Caltrans as well as obviously the Cal Fire doing forest management work and doing a lot of projects around there. I don't know if folks want to, if have experience with volunteer programs that still exist, but maybe you can get some information there from Meryl, and I don't know.
maybe a slightly different angle on that, Lindsay, is I do know that there is an increasing amount of philanthropic interest and support in job training, job development, particularly as we stare at a evolving job market due to AI and other factors. The idea that maybe part of your project description is that it's not simply, I don't want to say not only, but not simply or even not just power production, forest health, but it could even be part of the story. And I think this is part of maybe what I need to add to the list to my, add a fifth item to the list here. And it's like a real narrative explanation of how this benefits the community and how this has um, a long-term meaningful impact on both, forest health, long-term emissions and pollution reduction by reducing fire risk, but also the exciting opportunity in job development, and not just simple construction jobs, but job development operating a facility like this, and then the job development related to rebuilding our forest product economy and people's ability to engage in it. So I think that that's a really interesting narrative. I know it's a kind of a bank shot off the question itself, but the question is kind of getting at this bigger question of how do we bring more people into this work and engage them, and how do we, it's both a demand and a supply pull. You could suddenly create this demand for all this material. You need people who actually have experience and know how to do this work, so there's a training opportunity there as well.
Yeah, definitely, especially in this community's workforce development is yeah, to get more interest and get more people trained up in this workforce and in these communities. And I know that well, with We Prosper Together, the Yuba College got a grant to do an internship program where the folks got a stipend and they learned about fuels management and other types of job opportunities in the field. And we have been seeing a growth of that at community college mostly. But I saw Elisa Brown, who's a really great friend working at the Sierra Nevada Conservancy, said in the chat that tribal communities as well have great workforce programs and have a lot of or have seen like a growth in youth work crews and that do forest management and forest restoration projects. And that is also a really great partner to have on your side as we see more interest in supporting efforts for tribal communities to be more involved and more engaged and have opportunities to bring more biomass utilization and other projects to their lands as well.
Looks like we have a few more questions in the Q&A. Brian Wong says, when we have checked all the boxes that Dan mentioned, how do we reach out to Dan to explore on the services that his organization offers?
And maybe Dan, also maybe just generally, if you have tips about philanthropic, how to get more
Yeah.
involved or learn more about the philanthropic community.
Well, I think this specific area of investment, and that's why it's like, Lindsay, you sure you want me to talk to folks? Is not primarily an area of focus, the Emerson Collective. There is an offshoot organization of the Emerson Collective called the Waverly Street Foundation that would does a little bit more of work in this kind of space. I think really as you're doing this hard work, as you're building, this real budget, the demand, the community support, a big chunk of your research should be asking the question, who are the people who invest in this kind of area? But not just specifically in this area, because I think that, Lindsey and I talked about this. This is one of the challenges is that there is no philanthropy that's established itself as the biomass financing, the biomass energy financing, of philanthropy. There's a possibility someone does get excited about it and they do start that. Um, but understanding that a lot of this stuff is driven by philanthropies geographies. So understanding what the geographies of those philanthropies are. So the geographies could be like literal geographies, like they focus on the Intermountain West. And then there's the geographies of interest. Is it carbon reduction? Is it forest health? And so there's those that research is reasonably easy to do. And then you'd be fascinated that when you find those folks, how easy it is actually to just shoot someone there an email or a LinkedIn. They exist that like the people who work there exist to go and explore these ideas. So they're really interested in them. The way I came to have a chance to come and visit the site with Lindsey and help try to think of ideas about how to move it forward was through the why am I spacing on their name?
The
Um,
Nature Conservancy.
the Nature Conservancy. Like, yeah, that was a hard one to remember. Sorry. It's Friday,
Yeah.
uh, East Coast. The Nature Conservancy, and I happen to know someone in the Nature Conservancy who really was excited about this idea of, wood waste to, you know, community benefit. So I think a lot of it is relationships too, and trying to figure out your 6 degrees of separation. What I think was really interesting is this bringing together of people like you have, Lindsey and team, to do this, right? I think that this is the initial start of building the kind of coordinated interest that could actually attract someone to this field. And that's a separate conversation we're having is like, is it possible that you could create enough projects and enough interest and enough scale, and therefore diffuse the risk enough that you could actually bring in some very interested parties to do something meaningful. So I don't have a really easy answer for you on that, but I do think that this is the start of actually building, answers to that questions and building energy around these ideas.
Yeah, and I think that's completely the point, and is reaching out and asking those who you do know, because I think people, especially at Valley Vision and whatnot, want to be helpful. So if there's specific ask, we'll work to try to find a way to make connections, but we are building it or trying to build it right now. Like you mentioned, Dan, this is kind of the point of bringing everybody together, and the work that we're doing at We Prosper Together is try to do that research, make the connections, and build the relationships to get more interest, as well as figuring out how we can coordinate and build the right story, and get enough successes under our belt to really gain some traction within the investment world. And so, but yeah, so I think we like Camptonville Community Partnership, they are really great at building relationships, and being supportive of their community advocates for their community. So I think that's the way to start, is being active in your community, and just starting the conversation with others, and your world will grow, and it'll expand, especially if you do it intentionally, and hopefully reach the right people to help support in a finance way. Um, we'll go to the next question is, what kind of rate of return on investment you think is reasonable for biomass projects, given that these days Wall Street investors are looking for a pretty high rate of returns? Do you have any thoughts on that, Dan? Or is there some Is there a
You know,
magic number?
I think it's funny. There's a couple of questions in there. What do I think is a reasonable rate of return, and what does Wall Street think is a reasonable rate of return? And my view is that, and there's some interesting commentary in there too about how people might feel about the Wall Street rate of return. I think the trick is to say, like, go figure out what you believe your project's rate of return is, right? And you might surprise yourself and say, wow, I'd hit the Wall Street, lottery, right? In which case, you know, you can very quickly, there will be a lot of people who'll take your calls. The chances are, given this work and given the newness of it and the complexity of actually decontenting forests, particularly with small diameter materials, that this is going to be actually a hard case to make economically. That's when you have to start unpacking then what are those benefits calculations. One of the things I'm interested in, it's a personal interest that I'm exploring through a series of projects, is this idea of PRI capital, forgivable loans from DAFs, finding new kinds of ways of using philanthropic or impact capital that's recyclable, but not necessarily returning at traditional market rates. There is a lot of critique about impact capital ideas in the last, 5, 10 years or so, that it was just an excuse for providing, to create, a story to tell why an uneconomic project would consume resources that could be better deployed. I think that that's actually, a little too cynical and dismissive. I actually think that if you are disciplined and can actually demonstrate how a combination of um, uh, supportive capital adds up then to measurable benefits in community risk reduction, uh, CO2 reduction. I think you can make an economic story that gets to a rate of return that would be interesting to a philanthropy or an impact investor, if not a traditional commercial investor. So you just have to go that extra mile then to kind of tell that story, like how it adds up to something that looks like a commercial rate of return. It's just not a monetary commercial rate of return.
Yes. Get innovative.
Get innovative. Like the whole thing is going to require everyone being innovative. But I think that that actually is a feature, not a bug, because the non-innovative strategies is what got us to where we are today. So like if you want more of today, keep doing what you're doing. If you're really saying like, hey, I'm tired of watching millions of acres, billions of board feet, that could be homes, it could be energy, it could be, it could be improved forest health. I'm tired of seeing it go up in smoke. I'm tired of seeing it harming our communities, killing people, destroying habitat. I think that that's actually an argument that resonates with people who have capital. It's just a matter of kind of organizing, as you're doing now through these webinars and through building this community, organizing that message in a way that it's not just Lindsey pitching it. And I don't want to say just Lindsey, but like it's not just one of you sitting in the woods with one person saying like, and here's what we're trying to do. Like it's more of a cohesive narrative arc that explains then this broader investment strategy.
Yeah. Yes. Agreed. Thank you. Moving on to the next question is, do you think we need PURPA, PURPA, like agreements again for a better offtake opportunities for biomass projects?
Yeah, I don't know what the PURPA like agreement would look like. But I do think like having some kind of clear explanation of who your customer is, and the more formal and the more organized and the more, we'll say, PURPA like that could get, the better it is, right? And so that's why I think finding a community partner, like you did with the power and water company, perhaps with a state, county, or local, organization. I think finding something that says like, look, we're going to have someone who's going to buy this power from us. We know who the customer is, so we do have some security and certainty about what happens next. I think that that's just a way of de-risking it, and all these conversations are really around de-risking. In the case of philanthropy and impact, the risk then is a different kind of risk, which is a reputational risk, a perceptional risk, a who am I collaborating with risk. So there's a different kind of risk there. It's not necessarily the economic hurdle risk that you have with a commercial partner. It's like a different kind of fuzzier, more kind of how am I making sure I don't embarrass anyone risk,
Awesome. Thanks so
which
much.
can sometimes be a higher bar, frankly. Like you can actually, if you can get a 21% return, they won't care if someone puts 6 signs out in front of your project saying, you're you're stealing habitat. It might be different if it's a philanthropy or an impact investment. Like I didn't sign up for that.
Yeah,
So
definitely. Well, thank you, Dan. I it's 12:34, so don't want to take up more of your time, but I wanted to see,
no,
but really appreciate you answering the questions and giving to us straight, and wanted to see, do you have any closing thoughts that you'd like to leave before?
no. Again, I think I kind of tried to put them in the body of my kind of remarks in the sense that I think what you're doing is so important and so valuable. I really admire the fact that you've come together as communities uh, to uh, try to make the case and get people to understand a more kind of complex story of what our relationship with our forests and our forest communities is and needs to be. We're growing 10 billion board feet more a year than we're taking out of our forests. That's good news. That's exciting. But we're also then, burning up billions and billions of board feet that could be homes, that could be power, that could be better habitat. And so that's part of the story that needs to be told too. That could be jobs, that could be security in our communities, that could be safety, that could be, improved environments and ecosystems. It's complicated, and what you're trying to do is something complicated. In many ways, the complicated and difficult things is really what the actual role of philanthropy and impact investment should be. And I think over time, as you build momentum, there will also be an important opportunity to develop a market that is long-term self-sustaining and able to attract commercial capital too. So I'd like to stay close to this discussion. I really believe in what you're doing, and I appreciate you taking the time to do it. And I really appreciate you inviting me to join.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dan. Yay. Um, Appreciate it. And we will have a wrap up of the key points that Dan shared with us today, that will go out soon after the webinar is over. But thank you again, Dan.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, you too. And then we'll, as always, we are going to send it off to Neal. That will get through more of the actual blueprint, roadmap, as you will, of the different types of equity, debts, loans, kind of more of the nitty gritty. We really appreciate kind of the high level thought and perspective of what a philanthropic funder would be from Dan. But we'll put together some more key experts on the different types of funding opportunities that there are out there to share with you all. But without further ado, Neal will go over kind of all the different types of capital that you can look into to build a capital stack that will get your project hopefully fully financed and up and running. So Neal, take it away.
Thank you, Lindsey. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here again for the third and maybe final, maybe third or fourth webinar in the series. So today we're going to, as Lindsey has, of course, said, get into financing. And financing is really the stage in which your dreams either become reality or they hit a wall. We can all have great ideas, but unless we have the money to make them happen, we can't necessarily affect a change, bring about the economic development that we envision. So this is really where you go kind of from sketching things out to getting out into the real world, making the sausage and moving forward with projects or getting feedback and realizing that, oh, perhaps this project isn't necessarily as well thought out and won't be as well received as I might have imagined. So the recap last webinar was about productization. There were a few assignments, identifying potential customers, which is a thread which has run through all of the webinars, and it's part of this one as well because, like Dan mentioned, having the offtake is absolutely crucial, and that can be a huge difference between being a project that is fundable and being one in which people are skeptical. Also, writing your sentence about how your project is differentiated. It doesn't mean that you have to be completely different than anything else out there. It might be a matter of just where you're located or the process that you're using in order to, say, make a substrate for horticulture that's different than peat moss, like one of our attendees is doing. And then also looking at labs. Um, for analysis. So informal opening poll is which you can answer in the chat, which is, where are you in your funding journey? Is this something you're just exploring? Do you have a concept that you're pursuing, but you don't have the funding lined up yet? Are you actively seeking capital? Or have you funded your project and you're looking for the next round? Or, of course, I know a number of people are simply with organizations that are not necessarily pursuing funding on their own, might provide some funding or might be seeking funding for future projects. So for this webinar, we're going to have an imaginary case study, which we're going to call Sierra Soil Company, to kind of help show how a theoretical project of a modest scale would go about and get funding. So Sierra Soil Company, the idea is this imaginary soil amendment company um, produced with feedstock from forest residues and green waste collected from a county location. The market would be landscapers for offtakes, landscape products. The ideal site would be in conjunction with a public partner's land, such as at a dump where green waste is already brought and where there's extra space to alleviate the need to invest heavily in real estate. And we're imagining for $1.8 million in investment, it's going to produce 6 jobs and also divert unstated number of tons of waste from the landfill. The need would be for capital equipment for grinding, screening, creating a bagging line. So rather than solely selling in bulk, that would allow this company to sell to consumers and through landscape supply stores like a Home Depot or a Lowe's. The site work to house the equipment, working capital because any product business will have to carry a unknown amount of inventory before it starts getting paid. Um, and so what I'm envisioning for this is that of the 1.8 million, roughly 700,000 or 40%, they were able to secure in the form of grants, 800,000 in debt, and then 300,000 between equity and partnerships. Partnership being the county dump, county government providing the space, the land, in order to build the facility. So funding landscape, really 4 main ways to fund projects. We have, of course, mentioned grants quite a bit. They are the dream because that is the free money with few strings attached. It doesn't dilute your ownership, and it gives you capital that doesn't have to be paid back. The challenge with grants, of course, is that they can be very specific for what they're available for. And of course, they can be highly competitive because who doesn't love free money? Then we have debt, also known as loans, which can really take many forms. That can be in the form of a mortgage to buy a piece of land, equipment financing for a piece of equipment, a traditional bank loan, like a line of credit, to cover working capital, or also just venture debt, which can be general loans that can be very similar to an equity investment in that the funds can be used for any purpose. Then we have equity. Equity can get a bad name because, of course, you're taking slices of your pie and issuing that to investors. But it has a huge benefit over debt when available, which is that it doesn't have to be paid back. So you're not tied to a specific schedule to make things work and generate cash flow in order to pay back loans. Debt, as appealing as can be that, okay, I borrow this money, I pay it back, and I still own the whole thing, can be extremely dangerous because of the need to repay and the ramifications that come if a debt is not paid back in time. Um, the familiar example would be a house being repossessed, a car being repossessed, but entire businesses can be repossessed. And debt also often, especially in the early stages of companies, is tied to personal guarantees in which the bank or other lender can come after your personal assets, which you've backed a loan with. So I've always been a fan earlier on of taking a smaller slice of the pie, but not having that repayment pressure. It eliminates a lot of the personal risk, while also bringing on partners that are then seated next to you for the whole journey. And then partnerships. So like an example of the Sierra Soil Company, that would be having a partnership with a county government to have a long-term lease on a piece of land, associated with the landfill, the dump, or the transfer station, which is really advantageous towards building this type of operation and can really help to lower risk along the way. Most projects are not necessarily one thing or another, but we have a capital stack, which can be, two, three, maybe even all of these different means of financing, in order to make project happen. An important aspect of the capital stack is really the right capital at the right time and understanding what will be available. As Dan mentioned, use a term about mitigating risk over time. And as you go through the different stages of your project, you are lowering risk to a potential investor about whether or not they're ultimately going to get their money back. There's plenty of great ideas out there that never see the light of day, because they simply never move past the feasibility and planning stage. So as your project moves along, it's inherently less risky, more likely to bring about a positive return on investment, whether that's paying back a lender or ultimately allowing an equity investor to get a positive return on investment. So when you're in the early stages, as a number of you are, feasibility and planning, it's a highest risk because you know anyone can come with an idea and do a little bit of research and say that they're going to do something, but there's so many steps and so many things that need to align before you actually have that cash flow positive business. So at this stage, bank debt is almost certainly not going to be available unless you're leveraging your own personal assets. That's where grants come in, and grants exist at this stage for a reason because governments understand that there are a lot of great ideas out there, but many of them won't see the light of day unless there's some help. And that's where organizations like Cal Fire and such are looking for innovation, looking for ways to help solve the problems that they're looking to address. That's where grants come in. Development, once you've gone through your feasibility and planning and are ready to get started with the project as far as getting your permits, your engineering, your building design and such, to actually make the project physically move forward. That's where development comes in. And this is, of course, can still be equity, but this is a stage where typically equity investors might be able to be engaged, because you're showing that the project is in progress. Some risks have been mitigated in that you, for example, have a feasibility study behind you showing the market opportunity, showing that the facility that you're working on can be built, and you're moving forward with getting the permits to actually allow that to happen. Construction, stage three, often the biggest phase for a project, given the physical nature of biomass and the heavy equipment that's often required in order to process it. Um, this can be construction loans, traditional bank loans, equipment financing, um, so on and so forth, and also still um, still grants if available. Like, Cal Fire is a good example of helping with construction at times. Of course, those grants are highly competitive. Um, and then the final stage is, when everything's built, you're ready to start putting product out into the world, putting energy out into the world, whatever you're actually selling. This is the lowest risk because you have your facility built, you've have operations, and this is the capital required to allow it to start up and to grow. So I'm going a little further into grants and non-dilutive funding. Um, I'm looking at this from the perspective of basically four different buckets of grant money and grant-like money. So from the soil and farm practice perspective, there's the Healthy Soils Initiative, the USDA cost sharing. These aren't strictly grants, but they're federal monies that are available in order to allow pay the growers to help fund projects. Then we have air quality and burn alternatives, which are, of course, becoming more and more popular with air districts having like chipping incentives and such to avoid, what we've previously seen, especially here in California, like in the Central Valley, of just burning out orchards as they're getting replaced, or burning out vineyards, which of course has negative implications. So there's now incentives on a per acre basis to chip instead of burn. Um, Also, forest and wood markets. This is where CAL FIRE and the USDA wood innovation grants come in. Unfortunately, these have certainly been, especially on the federal level, been a bit curtailed in recent years. But money is still out there for some projects. And then energy fuels and rural business, such as California Energy Commission, USDA Rural Development. At the end of the presentation, I have a more comprehensive list of different grants that are available. One really important aspect of grants is that they kind of come and go, certainly depending upon what administrations are in charge. There can be periods of windfalls with lots of grants, and then there can be really lean times where entire grant programs get shut down. So it's important to understand what's out there. The web is your friend in seeing what programs are currently funding projects and what type of programs can fit well with the kind of work that you're looking to do. So, one of the beauties of grants is that they can be used in conjunction with other types of financing. One of the downsides of grants is that they're also often required to be used in conjunction with other types of financing through matching. So you'll often come across a grant where there has to be a 50% match, meaning that, let's say, the USDA will give you $250,000, but you'll also have to provide $250,000 as a match. That can sometimes, depending on the program, you could sometimes have a federal grant that then gets matched with a state grant. But that would only be the case if the state grant is not federally funded, as many of them are, many state grants are simply pass-throughs from federal funding. But there are instances where you could certainly match one grant with another if they're from two different sources, which aren't both federally funded. Um, Grants can also be stacked at different stages of the project for things like feasibility studies, and then later on for equipment, um, purchasing feedstock and such. Um, it is important to understand that grants often, won't cover many of the soft costs. That's where your equity and your debt will come in. So, an example of how, in our fictional soil company, you could have $250,000 USDA value added, U.S. Department of Agriculture. They have a lot of programs for different niches. Like one of my clients is an organic farm, and we have a grant in excess of $100,000 for value added related to artisanal strawberry growing. So it really, it's really worth the time to kind of look into different grant programs and see how something that you're doing might fit in to a grant program, and also ask the question of how something can be modified slightly in order to fit in um, with said grant programs. CAL FIRE as well, those grants right now are highly competitive. I think last year was only about $20 million, unfortunately. But of course, as we're talking about biomass and thinning out forests, they're often very aligned with the work that we're doing. Um, so in this, fictional scenario, 40% of the project is funded with three grants. That might be optimistic depending on the project, but it also might um, be realistic because the money is out there for the right projects. So winning a grant, as I said, super competitive. It's really important to understand what the grant is looking for in applying, and it's almost like a college application, trying to read people's minds and understand how you're going to fit in. So the more doubt that you can remove in an application, and the more closely aligned that you are with the work of the grantor, the more likely they are to um, to end up proving to be successful. Being a clear match to the program's priorities, real numbers, as Dan said, nothing's ever $10 million. Like really dialing into the numbers and giving concrete examples and of how you arrived at your numbers, whether that be having real construction estimates, having quotes for feedstock, having quotes for equipment, so on and so forth. You're trying to build credibility at this stage rather than um, just, guess at numbers and hope that somebody believes you. Also showing that you can actually secure the funding match. Um, Grant programs hate giving out grants that then don't get utilized because the match wasn't available, because of course then they're not meeting their goals. Part of it is also not just that you have this great idea and this great heart about the work that you're going to do, but you also have the team that is actually capable of performing the work, of running the facility, of coming up with the sales needed in order to make your company a success. And then also just, really making sure that you're at the right stage for the specific grant. Why applications can fail, the inverse of or opposite of real numbers is just trying to, BS your way through an application without taking the time to do the real work to arrive at the best estimates of numbers. Wrong program, inability to get the match, and not illustrating clearly where that match is going to come from can really be the dust bell of an application. Also, trying to get grants for costs that aren't actually eligible for a program. Um, and an area that I think is really important to consider is, it's going to be human beings on the other side um, reviewing your grants. And it's often possible to at least, make contact with people involved in some way, shape, or form with the grants. Reach out, try to get information, try to form relationships, because that, for better or worse, can actually help make a difference in being able to actually secure a grant or not. So strong, very simple version of the, grant would be $1.8 million facility diverting 8,000 tons per year of forest residue, creating 6 jobs with a signed landscape supply offtake and 40% committed match. Like, really checking all the boxes. It's a very simplistic version. Some grant applications can, especially for larger programs, can be many dozens, if not hundreds of hours. Um, but ultimately, the theory is the same of checking the boxes, building credibility, showing the grantor that you, as a recipient, can actually make the work happen and have the impact that you say that you're going to. Then moving on to debt and loans. Debt can take many different forms. And I would say there's kind of, two concepts behind debt, which is that A, it has to be paid back, and B, it has to, in some way, shape, or form, be secured if it's not going to be paid back. So a bunch of the um, debt programs that are out there aren't necessarily from a bunch of debt programs from the government aren't necessarily direct lending, but what these programs will do, such as the U.S. Department of Agriculture, B&I loans, business and industry, um, they're not actually lending money, but they're working with local lending institutions to say, we'll back the loan if this person doesn't repay. And those guarantees are often up to 80, I think sometimes as much as 90%. So let's say you borrow $1 million through the B&I program. The US government will tell the local bank that they work with, um, if this doesn't get paid back, we will guarantee 90%, 900,000. That makes it infinitely more possible to borrow money from local institutions than if they're going to be on the hook for the full million all by themselves. So B&I loans, all of these rates will vary, of course, as the federal prime interest rates vary, but generally on the lower side, 6 to 8%, maybe a bit higher now, as interest rates have been historically high for the last 20 years compared to where they were the last 20 years, but relatively reasonable rates. And the fact that it's backed by the federal government can often is the reason that these rates can be lower. USDA Section 9003, which is just a section of um, legislation. The long name is Biorefinery, Renewable Chemical and Bio-Based Product Manufacturing Assistance Program, similar to B&I for biorefining. These are also loan guarantees, but can be up to $250 million. These applications alone, the federal government estimates that they take an average of 700 hours to complete. So that's certainly not for small scale new projects. It would be for something larger scale, but it's good to know that they're out there as your entity scale, or if you are working with a bigger project. USDA REAP, now they have a guaranteed loan program. Up until the Trump administration, there was also a grant program, but that is unfortunately on hold. Many states, including California, have state green banks, which are entities formed basically mission-based lenders. In California, it's called the iBank. These are typically for infrastructure and lend at below market rate compared to private lenders. There's bond financing, which this is more relating to public-private partnerships, definitely not, smaller scale new projects, given that these have to often go through governments. Sometimes they have to face local referendums, but it is a form of debt that's available for larger projects, and then CDFIs, which are community development financial institutions, more mission-based lenders, typically focused on rural and underserved projects. And then what's not addressed on here is also just personal lending. There's always the bank of mom and dad. There's friends and family. Um, there's taking on personal debt. I mean, with any debt, I think it's really important to understand what you would be on the hook for if things go south, and if you're okay with that risk. Everybody believes that their project is going to be a huge success, make a bunch of money. But I think it's really important to be honest with yourself and understand, well, what has to happen in order for that success to actually come into being, and what are the ramifications for me if I sign a loan and then the company goes under? Do I lose my house? Do I lose, my other savings that I have? And that's where debt can be so scary. And I often think that, it should be avoided as much as possible if equity financing is available, especially in early stages before a company is proven. Moving towards commercial and private lending, you have traditional bank loans. These are going to be higher than the government-backed programs just because of the nature of the bank is taking on more risk, and therefore they need to assign interest rates commensurate with that risk. For biomass, where equipment is often the largest expense, equipment financing is definitely worth looking into. For equipment financing, you're often getting money to buy a piece of equipment. The equipment itself ends up being the collateral. So um, it doesn't, in many cases, there's no extra exposure. If things don't work out and the lender isn't getting repaid, they'll simply take their equipment back. And in which case, there's often not personal guarantees involved. Um, Lines of credit, these are often for established businesses that are showing that they have ongoing cash flow, but perhaps have cyclical cash flow where they have to, say, build up inventory early on before like a spring growing season when lots of soil amendments and such are being sold in the case of our soil company. These can be really favorable because they provide the right money at the right time, without having to take out a term loan that you're paying interest on the whole time. Friends and family, which can really be a great way for small companies to get going. But there's that risk of not being able to pay back mom and dad or your brother and such. And that can be really uncomfortable around Thanksgiving dinner. Um, and then also, vendor financing can be similar to equipment financing, except directly from the companies that are selling you the equipment. And then there is private venture and angel debt. This is typically quite expensive. So it has the challenge that you're not only having to pay back the money, but you're having to pay it back at potentially the highest rate of anything else out there, which in turn, of course, makes it even more difficult for you to pay that money back. So I would definitely caution, especially at the early stages when your cash flow isn't proven, to be really wary of taking on higher interest private debt. You might need to ask yourself, if that's the only option, why is that the only option? And what should be done? Whether it's just decide, this isn't the project to fund, or change things so that other capital is available. So what do lenders need to see? Biggest fundamental thing, of course, is that they need to get their money back, as scheduled. And so looking at that is the debt service coverage ratio. This is basically saying, on a monthly, quarterly, annual basis, how much cash are you bringing in excess of your expenses, and how does that relate to your debt payments? And most lenders are going to want to see a debt service coverage ratio of at least 1.25%, meaning there's going to be 25% more cash needed than there's going to be 25% more cash than is needed to pay back the loan in any given period of time to provide a buffer if things change. Collateral, and this is something that really trips people up. It's I've seen people lose their houses when businesses go south and they've provided their house. They've taken out a second mortgage to provide collateral um, for their loans. So, really think about and understand what your loan agreement is, and think about the ramifications of what happens if things don't work out, and if that is something that you are comfortable with. Lenders, of course, an important part of getting to a positive debt service coverage ratio, and not having to dive into the collateral is having the ability to sell your product, whether that be the physical product or energy. Um, that's where signed offtakes can really be the difference between a lender being comfortable with your project and understanding that there is credibility behind it, that there will be cash coming from it, or still being skeptical and wondering if the project is simply too risky. So in the case of our soil company, we have a signed supply agreement well in advance, saying that some local landscape supply distributor is going to buy X number of tons or yards of this product at this price once manufacturing commences for a certain period of time. Those sorts of agreements can certainly be tricky to get before you know exactly when you'll be opening, but they can be a great investment of time and can not only make debt accessible, but also make debt accessible at a much lower rate than if you only have like a letter of intent saying that they intend to buy the product, but they're not necessarily contractually obliged to. Um, so, definitely think about the project and how you're going to make those signed off takes possible. Um, yeah, ultimately, it's really about building credibility and trust and letting lenders know that you're going to be able to execute and get the debt paid off in a time period in which it has to be. And then on to equity investment. Equity investment is just like buying, stock in SpaceX, except when you're buying equity on the stock market, that's public equities. Many businesses are funded with private equity, which is when you have equity, a slice of your company that you're selling to private shareholders in exchange for ownership. So um, the thing that scares people about equity is you no longer own the whole thing all by yourself, but you're giving up a slice. The upside of that is that you don't have the repayment pressure um, for paying back the capital. Uh, there's no timeline because you don't have to make payments. Another benefit of having equity investors is that when things do take longer, take more money, as a result, you have partners in the business with you who have that vested interest, have the skin in the game, who can often help to bring in the next rounds of equity investment because their interests are very much aligned with you. Equity investments are typically, more appealing to investors when it's higher growth projects. It's just kind of the nature of it. Folks want to know that this capital that they're giving up for a certain period of time is going to earn a certain return on investment. Um, I know there was a question in the chat earlier about, well, what's an acceptable return on investment? It's really going to depend on the project, on the investor. For biomass projects, I think um, potential investors are investing typically not just because they think that it's going to be the best economic return, but because of the value to society. And as a result, those ROIs, are acceptable at lower rates, like 10 to 15%, as opposed to if venture capital is investing in a microchip startup, they're going to want ROIs, 40+% in order to make their investment worthwhile. So in our example with CR Soil, um, the partner of the county becomes an equity investor in exchange for, the use of the land. And in this example, it was 16%. So grants are great because you don't need to return the money, but of course they're very limited and very specific for certain purposes and very competitive. Debt can be widely available in different slices for different purposes. But the huge challenge is it has to be paid back. Equity, um, you know, you kind of go on a shared journey with folks, have shared risk, and it alleviates the pressure to pay things back. And if we think back to webinar one, Luke Carpenter was talking about basically how everything in the biomass world tends to take years longer and cost twice as much. And obviously that's not true for everyone, but it's true for many. And equity investments help to eliminate that risk. So, um, kind of looking at, who invests and what they want. Friends and family for smaller ventures are often the first route. Many people, start with the folks, the siblings, and such to get that, initial small infusion of capital. But it's great if everything wins, but it's really uncomfortable if things don't work out. So you definitely have to think about the non-cash implications of those investments. Then there's angels. Angels, just another name for individual investors, often with larger pools of capital. Sometimes you'll hear about angel groups of individuals who like to make venture investments. These are, most often, larger investments than you would get with your family. Um, these are people that are, not related to you. And as a result, there's a different risk. You have that arm's length transaction where you don't have to worry about, letting down your family members. And then once you move on from angels and need larger checks, that's where you go to impact and strategic funds. These are the organizations that, are private investment funds can often write checks from the, hundreds of thousands into the many millions. And this, for larger projects or as you scale, are the places where you're going to capital. There's also the expectation with these larger investments of higher returns, most typically. And then partnership and ownership models, which can really be helpful for projects like biomass that often make an enormous amount of sense to co-locate with other projects or facilities. Um, so, who owns the projects? Self-owned can be, speaking from experience, it can be a really lonely journey. And it can be really limiting because you're on it, all by yourself. And when there's extra capital that's needed, it's up to you. When you have investors, of course, you're giving up a slice or many slices of the pie. But there's the shared upside, and there's also the kind of the shared goal as additional investment is needed in order to go about and find that investment. And then, when you start looking at public-private partnerships, there's often giving up more control. but as a result, you're also lowering risk. So, like in the case of Sierra Soil, we're not having to raise hundreds of thousands of additional dollars because the county's providing the land, and as a result, they were getting that 16% stake. Um, so thinking about this is true for equity investments, it's really true for debt as well. It's like, how do you convince investors, whether those be debt or equity investors, that your project is the right one for them, that your project is a place to put their money, rather than any of the many other alternatives that they have for their money, including just simply leaving it in a bank and collecting interest. Um, and it's, sound like a broken record, but offtake agreements can really be everything and make a huge difference about whether or not somebody, believes that your business financials make sense, that the cash flow is going to work out, and that in some way, shape, or form, whether it's repaying debt or building up cash and maybe paying a dividend to investors, or ultimately selling the business because it's profitable and appealing. The offtake agreement is really the start of that. Um, Having hosts or site agreements like we have with Sierra Soil with the local county, something like that. If there's a piece of land that you don't have to buy, if there's a building that you don't have to build, because this equipment is and this asset is already available with a partner, giving them a slice of equity instead can really help lower risk. As with biomass, having a partnership with an entity that's providing the feedstock in the right place, in the right form, can be a huge strategic advantage and also take an enormous amount of risk out of a project. That ties in with the feedstock supply deal. Ultimately, you're going to have all of them. Um, it's great if you have an offtake agreement, but if you don't actually have the feedstock, your credibility isn't, you're not going to have the credibility with an investor or with a lender. And that all ties in with the decision of where to locate. Is the feedstock available? Will that feedstock be available long term, or is it only something that can be secured for short term and therefore um, increasing the overall risk of the project? Um, and then other things that can help unlock unlock capital are the ability to there being federal tax credits, sometimes state or other local tax credits, which can help ultimately lower the cost of a project, and therefore make it more appealing to your equity investors, knowing that less capital will be required. So then as we move towards the end, packaging things up for lenders and investors. Um, as we think about banks, it's pretty similar for equity as well. You know, letting people know what you're going to do and building the credibility around the plan and the numbers behind it. So first up is, really a feasibility study, showing that there is both the demand for the product and the ability to manufacture it in a certain location, then building a financial model, taking the concepts from a feasibility study, expanding upon them financially, and showing ultimately what's the widget that you're selling, what does it cost you to make, factoring in all expenses, what can it be sold for, how many of them can be sold, and what does the bottom line, what do the earnings look like, at the end of year one, year two, three, four, and five, and possibly beyond. Then showing that the facility, the project that you want to build, can actually be built, having the offtake as we've shown, and then also a very important area that can often be forgotten is that you'll need the team. You know, I know many times I've done this myself, moved into an industry that I've never worked in before, and a way to help build credibility with lenders or potential investors is to show that you're not the only talent, but that you have others who have worked in the industry who can, um, help the help the company come into reality and achieve the financial goals that you've stated. And then, of course, finally, just understanding how much capital you're going to need. So, who helped you with this? Technical consultants for feasibility studies. I think Valley Vision probably has some folks, some resources that if people are wondering about that, financial agent CFOs, people like myself who can help to create the financial model um, and show how the venture will in fact, be profitable and either pay back its loans or ultimately get the investors a strong return on investment. And just overall, just having folks that believe in the project, whether that be, your offtake partner, your feedstock partners, having those folks who can help to make your ideas a reality, can be extremely important to put everything together. So for our soil company, we secured grants about 700,000 early on. We got offtakes from a wholesale distributor that allowed us to have a loan of $800,000. We still needed some additional capital, which we got in the form of the partnership with the county, co-locating at the landfill and transfer facility. So we didn't have to go out and buy land or lease land on our own. Then went about build the facility, operate, we maintain our debt service coverage ratio, and everything's wonderful with no problems whatsoever. Um, so that's kind of the theoretical thing. Of course, there will always be problems and always take longer. But the important thing is to prepare, try to understand the contingency planning, and think further down the road about, well, if we need more capital, if this doesn't work out as we planned, where will this come from? A few more minutes left. But thinking about the deal killers, it really goes back to, you can't have biomass without the biomass. We need to have feedstock, need to have an ongoing long-term supply for it that makes sense so that a ton of money isn't being spent trucking it in from vast distances. And then, of course, have to have somebody to offtake either the energy or the physical product. And then, numbers that don't hold up. It's important to be honest as you go through and create your financial model. And there will be cases in which, you have a great idea, but unfortunately just doesn't pan out financially. And then that's a matter of, are there ways to tweak the ideas? Can the facility be built for less? Can you co-locate to lower startup costs? Can you actually charge more for product than you thought that you can? Um, you know, it, it's a matter of finding the right answer that can really hold up, especially to scrutiny as you go out to potential investors. So it's really the end of it. I know we'll have a few minutes for questions, but this is the end of the third webinar. I would encourage everyone to who is pursuing a project to think about like what realistically do you think your capital stack can look like. Research grants, that the research phase doesn't take a huge amount of time, can be really exceptional return on investment. And then offtake, offtake, offtake. Start working on that, having initial conversations with potential offtake partners, in order to help, bring your project to the light of day. And I think that is it. We have some resources at the end, and we'll have a little bit of time for questions. I don't have to hop off at 1:30 on the dot, so if folks have questions. And Lindsey, did you want to choose questions or?
I was just going back to see if there was questions. I know
If
we
there
had
are any.
comments and people chatting with each other, so that was
Oh,
really great to see. So thank you all so much. But I think that um yeah, there was great. I don't see any questions. If there was one and I'm missing it, please, if you don't mind repasting it into the chat for me, appreciate it. But in the meantime, yeah, really appreciate the questions that we did receive today and your participation. Um, and I think, yes, thank you so much, Neal. You've been really great. We are looking to seeing what interests there are and where we can expand. And I'll actually send it off to Sam to close it out and talk about next steps. But thank you, everyone.
Sure. Actually, we just got a 11th
Oh,
hour question here. Have you seen any wider projects being formed around burn scars?
um,
I'm not aware of any, but Lindsay, maybe you are.
Sierra Institute does a lot of is working on projects. A mass timber, small mass timber, a small mill, and a couple other projects near the Dixie Fire. We do have a lot of work in the South Lake Tahoe area that is going on around the Candor Fire as well. So that has been, so there are some projects that are forming around, some of the more larger complex fires that we've had. If there's more to that question, happy to answer it, or we'll email the slides out and the recording, and you hopefully you've here because you've also received an email from me, so which has my phone number. So happy to chat more about this question or questions like this as well. I think Samuel might maybe talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you all so much for attending this webinar and our past webinars in this series. And a huge thank you to Lindsey and Neal for leading this effort. Yes, thank you very much, Adrian. I'll never miss an opportunity to do a shameless plug. Valley Vision's holding our We Prosper Together Catalyst Summit on September 9th. Early bird pricing does end tonight at midnight or 11:59. So yeah, our early bird pricing for $30 for the entire day of programming and content. It's a great opportunity to come and celebrate our Catalyst projects, which you can see on our We Prosper Together website. But yes, again, you're all invited to that, and I hope to see you there, and we hope to hear from you all soon. Great.